Well, when I recently launched this podcast, I was hoping to collect conversations from a wide variety of interesting people. And I wanted to talk to poets, priests, scholars, songwriters, educators, people who've traveled on foot. And at one point, it dawned on me that if I could just get Malcolm Guite to agree to a conversation, I could achieve all of this in one fell swoop. And to my delight, he did agree. And so here today, we're in conversation with a poet, a priest, a scholar, a songwriter, an educator, and a traveler on foot. And it's a great honor to welcome Malcolm Guite to the Common Toad podcast. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here. And yes, I think I probably am all of the things you said in one way or another, sometimes some of them simultaneously. I find walking on foot actually is quite good for composing poetry, the rhythm of the walk and the peacefulness often of it. You can find the line as you walk.
That's very good. Before we start, I wanted to first toast you, and I think you poured a drink already, but I have to pour.
I have, yeah, I confess.
That's quite all right. Let me get into it because I wanted to toast you because I just realized yesterday you published another book officially, right?
Yes, officially, yes, it came out, although I haven't myself seen a copy of it yet. But yeah, the second, I write a weekly column for the Church Times, which are just 500 or 600 word meditative reflection on life and, noticing small things and unfolding them gently.
Yeah.
Poet's Corner. And my publisher's kindly been collecting those into, or getting me to collect them into little collected volumes of essays. And the second of those, Poet's Corner series, has just come out. It's called Heaven in Ordinary.
Well, I made my online purchase yesterday, and I encourage, we'll link to it when we publish this.
That's pretty kind. I mean, I think it makes nice bedside reading, or possibly, it's the kind of book which in my house would end up in the loo, So you have a little library shelf in there. You don't want something that's too long. You don't want something where you've got to find out what happens in the next chapter. You want something diverting.
Well, here, and good luck to it. And
cheers. I raise a glass in your direction.
Very good. I discovered you first. I really started paying attention, I suppose. We were trying to figure out before I started recording how it is that I actually knew who you were and where I first learned it. I can't really remember, but I was very taken by your series on YouTube called Spell in the Library. And I see that we're in the library right now.
Yeah. This is my sort of habitual abode, as it were. Yeah, I did that partly because one of the sadnesses of lockdown was that I have a study, or I did have, I've just moved out of it now, but I did have this is my study at home, but I also had one in my college. And it was lovely in my college. I was chaplain, so I more or less had an open door and people could drop in for any reason, really. And as well as my teaching and supervising students in English literature. And I loved it, when students popped round and we'd have a drink and a chat, and I'd pull books off the shelf and read things. And all of that just stopped dead in its tracks. And so I thought it might be nice to just keep doing that, as it were, for my virtual visitor, and just carry on as normal. So none of those is in any sense scripted or pre-planned or anything, My kind wife, or now that she's home with us again, my daughter, act as the proxy and sort of hold the camera.
They're the mysterious visitors.
Yeah, they are the mysterious visitors, but they're really you.
Right. Exactly.
You are visiting in their eyes. And then I whatever happens to be to hand, I pull a book off the shelf, I show you a lovely edition of something, I read a poem I enjoy, I reflect on Yeats or Keats or anything. I occasionally talk about my pipes, and I quite often have a drink in my hand. So it's a true delight.
Very interesting, and it's just the sort of thing that that interests me, and I think interests a lot of people. And it occurred to me that it's good for people who might be unfamiliar or even skeptical of poetry in general, because there's a big difference between a poetry on a blank page and maybe something intimidating about it to someone who's
poetry was as it were first invented. I mean, poetry precedes literacy, not only in the big cultural scope that there was oral poetry and oral tradition before there was writing, but for most of us, if we're lucky, at least if we've had some nursery rhymes recited to us as children, if not any other poetry, poetry also precedes literacy for us. And actually, the poem on the page is only a little bit of code. It's not the poem. It becomes the poem when it sort of shimmers into being, when it's spoken in the air and sounded and tasted on the tongue. And I reckon it to be the mark of a good poem. If you're sat in a library where everybody's going shh, and you suddenly read for the first time a really good poem, supposing you had the happiness of just for the first time discovering, say, Keats's Ode to a Nightingale, I would defy you, if you really love poetry, not to, you know, brave the librarian's wrath and end up saying, I mean, when you get, you know, thou light-winged dryad of the trees, in beechen green and shadows numberless, singest of summer in a full-throated ease. You can't not say that.
Yes, that's right.
The sound of it.
And I'm glad you mentioned it in terms of nursery rhymes, and because I think a lot of, certainly the way that I kind of got into it a bit, and I still have only really dipped my foot in, but I got into it, I think, through folk music. And I noticed that you sometimes mention Leonard Cohen, and he was probably, for me, you know, a 15-year-old sitting in his room playing a Leonard Cohen record. I realized that, okay, I was trying to figure out at that point, what is the difference between a song and a poem? Because he was clearly a poet as well as a singer and a songwriter. Is there really a difference between, besides the musical accompaniment, is there a difference between a song and a poem?
The phrase that's used by literary critics to describe the thing we think of as a poem, a short poem that's a piece unto itself that, you know, is on one page or one or two pages, that's usually described as lyric poetry,
right,
as opposed to epic poetry. And lyric poetry, the word lyric, of course, comes from the Greek word for lyre, L-Y-R-E.
Okay.
And a lyre is a stringed instrument. And when you go back into the Greek epics, you know, if you think about the Odyssey or the Iliad by Homer, there's always a scene in those of a big banquet or a feast. And then the poet steps up, and the poet always has some kind of stringed instrument, thrums it, gets everybody's attention, starts the poem, and chants it with this thrumming background.
Yeah.
Which, to be honest, particularly in the later Leonard Cohen albums, that's exactly what Leonard Cohen does. I mean, he kind of,
pretty much,
he's, you know, towards the end he was short on tune and long on lyrics, but it was great. It was great.
Yeah, that's right. He pushed the background singer button, and he pushed the, you know.
Yeah, the fact, of course, is that as he's got older, his voice deepened magnificently.
It did. And that last record was lyrically very.
Oh yeah, he didn't tail off. I mean, he was. But the other thing I think that I'd want to keep the connection between folk song and lyric poetry. Obviously, one of the great poetry revivals in England in the Romantic movement was the production by Wordsworth and Coleridge, at first anonymously, of a book called Lyrical Ballads. That was literally the name of the book that, you know, began the Romantic movement in English. Okay. And you've got lyric and you've got ballads. And they had rediscovered the early ballads that, of course, were sung, the kind of ballads of the sort of 17th century, really, the border ballads, the Scotch minstrelsy, as Scott called it. And so if you think about Coleridge's Ancient Mariner, you know, and the famous strong rhythms of, you know, it is an ancient mariner, he's stuck with one of three, by that long grey beard and glittering eye, now wherefore stopp'st thou me, you know, and, you know, the fair breeze blew, the white foam flew, the furrow followed free. We were the first that ever burst into that silent sea. You can hear the music in that. You can see immediately that that could be sung. But the reason why I want to preserve the link now is, and this is also the reason why I think a lot of our contemporaries have issues or problems, as they think, with poetry, is that when poetry moved off the tongue and onto the page, it became possible to do very sophisticated things on the page that didn't necessarily come out fully in a first reading and didn't necessarily sound beautiful, although they might look very clever on the page. And when in the 20th century, under the double influence of Ezra Pound and T.S. Eliot, poets decided to write, in inverted commas, free verse, and to forsake the originally musical structure of meter and rhyme. That is to say, meter is a rhythm and rhyme obviously is the pattern of echoing sounds. It became possible to write poetry that didn't, in some sense, sound like poetry, and was only qualified as poetry on the page because the lines didn't reach the end of the page, you know. But it wasn't always clear why a line ended where it did. And when that also took a turn into a kind of interior, confessional, sometimes willfully obscure kind of writing, you might be mysterious and resonant as a ballad writer, but you couldn't be willfully obscure. People needed to get the story.
Yes.
Moved along by it. So I think in the pinnacle of what is now referred to as high modernism, particularly spurred on by a comment of Eliot's that he felt in these difficult days poetry needed to be difficult. Some minor poets who then unfortunately got published quite widely misread that to understand if it's difficult it must be poetry, which is not the same thing.
No.
So I think a lot of high-end published poetry was actually extremely obscure and difficult to read and needed lots of footnotes and professors to explain it. And poetry became a sort of coterie academic pursuit, which I think was tragic for poetry and tragic for poetry readers. But poetry, of course, the earlier kind of poetry didn't die. It simply moved back off the page and onto the tongue. And just when poetry in the published world was at its most unrhythmic, unmusical, and willfully obscure.
You put it as deliberately trying to put
got
the reader
Dylan.
off.
You know, Dylan could do obscurity along with the best, but there was always something in the obscurity. So you got Dylan, Leonard Cohen, Neil Young, you know, on our side of the Atlantic, Nick Drake, Richard Thompson.
Richard Thompson and Linda Thompson.
Richard and Linda Thompson, absolutely magnificent. So, and they were all drawing on that earlier ballad tradition.
Just a little aside, did you know that Nick Drake's mother was a songwriter and pianist?
No, I didn't know that.
I didn't know this until about 2 years ago, and it turns out she's this wonderful singer, and she made a lot of recordings, I think in the 50s, just at home on her piano. And I'll link to that, and I'll send you some of those too.
All right, I'd love to see it.
You can hear it. You can hear it in that voice. But I'm glad that this is a great way to put it, that the poetry, the lyric poetry, never really went away. It just kind of backed off the page, and that's quite interesting as that coincides with folk music. You put it one way, I think somewhere that you said that modern poetry was almost deliberately trying to put the reader off.
Yeah, exactly.
There is something to that.
And I mean, it was really tragic because there were some great poets who did that unnecessarily. I mean, he's died just recently, but certainly a major contemporary poet of our time, English poet, is Geoffrey Hill. And Geoffrey Hill can write the most beautiful sonnets when he wants to.
Yeah.
But he kind of took a turn for quite a long time in his poetry where he just pushed the reader away. Yeah. And I remember going to a reading of his once where he spoke with great contempt of a very popular BBC Radio 4 program called Poetry Please. And he objected even, which was, he should have loved it. It was, you know, popularizing poetry, and they had very good poetry. But he spoke of it with contempt and said, poetry please, indeed. Poetry should never aim to please. And I thought, oh, come on, you know, Sir Philip Sidney, who wrote The Great Defence of Poetry, said, poetry must both delight and instruct. And unfortunately, a lot of contemporary poetry has been plenty of obscure instruction, but no delight at all.
Yeah, where would you say, if somebody is kind of interested in turning or trying to find an entry point into poetry, is there an easy way to do that? Do you have a kind of a go-to name or era?
Well, I mean, the thing that made me want to be a poet, the poetry that just, I thought, oh my goodness, I didn't even know English could sound like that, was John Keats. I was taken as a teenager to Keats's house, and I didn't know anything about Keats, and I wasn't sure I would be interested. But they had the Ode to a Nightingale up on the wall, you know, and you could look out through the windows to the tree where the nightingale sang.
Yes.
I read this and I was just astonished by it. And I don't think you can, you know, Keats will come in and out of fashion. But the great odes of Keats, they're not that long. They're astonishingly beautiful poetry. I think if you want to just be enchanted by poetry and get a sense of the potentiality of music and sound in poetry, then I think Keats is a strong contender. In terms of other classic poets that you can, if you want to have poetry which is challenging but still has kind of beautiful sound, but it's also got a lot of muscle and a lot of intellectual work going on in it,
Yep.
then John Donne is great. And
he's a little bit hard sometimes, but once you get
I mean, he's a 16th or 17th century poet, so he's, there's a language issue, but it's not that big.
It's not that bad.
Particularly not in the love poetry.
Right.
If you read Donne's love poetry, I mean, you've got no difficulty with the poem that begins, "For God's sake, hold your tongue and let me love."
Right.
That's great. But he's very powerful. And again, leaping forward a little bit, I mean, a lot of people who want to just love the sound of poetry and then get enchanted with more than that will read Gerard Manley Hopkins. And again, not always easy, but the sound is so fantastic that you kind of stay with the poem even if you don't get it. And that's the other thing. A poem is not, it's not a little, note that has to be read now and acted on immediately. It's more like a depth charge that's you put down in your mind, and it goes off way later and say, oh my goodness, I suddenly get that.
Yeah. And
it doesn't matter how long you take to get something in a poem. The poem will wait with you and for you, and suddenly a line will surface and you'll say, I always loved that line and I never got it, but now I'm standing here feeling this about that person.
Yes.
And suddenly I know what he means.
Yes.
There's, in terms of contemporary poets, where there isn't we're not negotiating a gap in the change of language or anything like that. I mean, on this side of the Atlantic, for sheer, ease of reading and yet powerful, sort of long, slow delivery in your mind afterwards. I mean, he's a very bleak poet, but he's wonderful. The English love him. He does a particular kind of English melancholy very well, and that is Philip Larkin.
Yes.
So Philip Larkin, and just to take a line at random, the trees are coming into leaf like something almost being said.
Yes.
The recent buds relax and spread. Their greenness is a kind of grief.
Yeah, he's kind of unmatched in his own way.
Yeah, but also, I mean, this be the verse with its, famously rude opening. I don't know if I'm allowed to say it in the podcast, but people can look at it.
Yes, anything can be said.
But, that poem, I don't agree with that poem in the sense that I think it needs replying to.
Yeah.
And yet I'm glad that somebody said it. When you're feeling at your actually worst, when he says, the last verse of that poem, man hands on misery to man, it deepens like a coastal shelf. Get out as quickly as you can and don't have any kids yourself. Now, I mean, I disagree with that profoundly. I haven't got out as quickly as I can and I have had kids.
Yes, right.
But it's not that I haven't looked.
But there's something there.
And stood in that place and thought, well, I'm glad somebody said that, even if it's only for me to contradict it, because it is a thought that passes through your head. Well, but then Larkin will suddenly lift you into something, beautiful. One of my favorite Larkin poems is called Church Going, where he starts off trying to say, there's nothing in this. It's all just, claptrap and it's all going to,
Yes.
And yet then he has this awful thing. He says, hatless, I take off my cycle clips in awkward reverence. And in the end, even though he's dismissed it and said the place is not worth stopping for.
And yet I did.
Yes.
In
fact, I often do. And then he says, a serious house on serious earth it is, in whose blent air all our compulsions meet, are recognized and robed as destinies. I mean, that's astonishingly good poetry. And you notice I'm quoting, I mean, I've never sat down and said, I will now memorize a Philip Larkin poem, but I've simply read it again and again because I loved it so much. So now I have a conversation with you and I find it comes to my mind unbidden. I wouldn't remember, there are certain obscure, the kind of poet who writes a poem called Prose Poem Towards a Definition of Itself, which is a genuine title I saw in print. I'm not going to remember that.
No, you might try to forget it.
Literally disappearing up its own arse. I mean, there's no point in it. But Larkin
Larkin, yeah, Larkin is of two minds. He understands both. He's coming at it from one perspective, but he's
but if you read Larkin, the antidote to Larkin, and indeed a poet who in an essay wrote an open rebuke to Larkin, although he knew and admired him.
Yep.
The antidote to Larkin is Seamus Heaney.
Yes.
Now he is, you know, without doubt, one of the great poets of all time, and we happen to have been very fortunate to have lived in his time. And you can start almost anywhere with Heaney, but you know, Heaney will give and give and give.
That's a great list. I just started listening to him. I think to read his translation of Beowulf, which is available.
Oh wow, it's great, yeah.
And that was another example of just bringing might be formidable text or seemingly formidable text to life with good reading. And it's interesting that you mentioned Larkin too, because he is one who is in one sense caught up in his age, but also has seen life from all the way around in some sense.
Yeah. I love the way in one of his poems, some guy's trying to write a biography and he quotes this American who's trying to write about him and who refers to Larkin, and Larkin then quotes it in the poem as an old style, natural, fouled up guy.
Yeah, that's pretty good.
That covers all of us, you know.
So I wanted to ask you this too, Ed. Before we actually started recording, I mentioned that I had a little son. He's almost 18 months old, and I'm starting to think about how to help him along in his relationship with not just poetry and books and literature, but just the imagination itself.
Yeah, and of course he may help you because he's probably living in a far more poetic world than either of us.
Right.
You know, if you read Wordsworth's Ode on Intimations of Immortality, you know, he says, not naked do we come trailing clouds of glory, you know, heaven lies about us in our infancy. You think about the poetic, not only the intellectual poetic world that a child does as they begin to develop language, finding metaphors and symbols, making the outer inner and the inner outer. That's what poetry is. I mean, Coleridge said that a poet is precisely a person who brings the vision of the child into the powers of the adult.
Yes, yes.
So your son's already ahead of you, but what you can do is read him lovely stuff and chant to him.
Chant.
Have him hear. I mean, nursery rhymes are great, but there's no reason that you shouldn't chant beautiful things to your child even before they're capable of understanding them, because the rhythm will go in. I mean, my mother particularly did that for me all the time, not because she'd read some parenting book that she said she should do it, but because she was full of poetry and she naturally expressed herself that way. And
so you grew up around this completely from the very beginning. You were immersed in this world.
Yeah. I mean, both my parents to some degree, but my mother more. I saw more. It was a fairly old-fashioned household, and in some respects, so it was of its time, you know, in the 50s and early 60s, and I saw more of my mother than I did of my father.
Yeah.
So as in my infancy and my, you know, younger growing stages, it was my mother who would just, you know, she would recite poetry. She would also sing, you know. She was a Scotswoman, and she'd sing, you know, Eubanks, and she'd sing things which a 5-year-old is not going to get, in the sense that they haven't got the experience of life.
Yeah.
So she'd sing, you know, ye banks and braes of bonny Doon, how can ye bloom sae fresh and fair? How can ye chant, ye warbling bird, when I'm sae weary and full of care? With lightsome heart I pulled a rose, full sweet upon the flowering tree. But my false lover, he stole my rose, but he left the thorn with me. Well, I mean, a 5-year-old is not going to understand what that last verse means.
Yeah.
But a 5-year-old knows about roses and thorns and prickles on flowers.
Yes, they can start.
And something has been given to you about the very nature of life and the bittersweetness of love. And, you know, it's all there.
Yeah, I set this part aside too. I wanted to read, and it's exactly what you said. This is from Chesterton in Orthodoxy.
Oh, it's a great book, that.
He says, a child of 7 is excited by being told that Tommy opened a door and saw a dragon, but a child of 3 is excited by being told that Tommy opened a door.
Yes,
And then later said, these tales that say that apples were golden only to refresh the forgotten moment that we found that they were green, and they make rivers run with wine only to make us remember for that one wild moment that they run with water. So
Yeah.
that is essentially exactly what you were saying, that it's really as you grow older that you're in danger of losing.
Yeah, and the whole purpose of poetry is precisely to restore that wonder.
Yeah.
I mean, as Coleridge says in the biography, he says that what he and Wordsworth were trying to do when they wrote the lyrical ballads was to remove what beautiful phrase, to remove the film of familiarity, which our selfishness and solicitude has cast over the world, and restore to us the freshness and the wonder in things, for which Coleridge says, echoing scripture, we have eyes that see not, ears that hear not, and hearts that neither feel nor understand. So poetry for them was not an escapist, weird little inner peculiar vision of the poet thing. It was much more like wiping the dust off the lens of the telescope, or, you know, cleaning the windows so that you could see. Reminds me, actually, one of the things I think, talking about singer-songwriters and the folk tradition, I don't know if you know the Van Morrison song, Cleaning Windows.
I don't know if I know that one.
Oh, it's a great song, which is about the fact that he was a window cleaner as a teenager, you know. But it's on an album which is entirely full of mystical vision. And you realize that actually it's a kind of gentle comment that for a while he was literally cleaning windows.
Yeah.
And basically his whole life as a singer has been cleaning windows.
Doing the same thing. That's good. Yeah, I wanted, when you talk about the film that is spread across the wonder of life that we all kind of develop, and maybe lends to sort of jadedness about life, I wanted to talk about the difficulty of talking about the value of imagination and art and poetry and beauty when you compare it to things like science, material things. These things, it's more easy to make a clear case for in terms of why you need it. It's obvious why you need food. It's obviously why you need shelter. But even though everybody kind of knows that you need an inner life, an imagination, and you need art, it's harder to pin down exactly why. And I wanted to mention, because you're very good, you've spent a lot of time studying what's known as the Inklings group. C.S. Lewis, J.R. Tolkien are the most famous ones people might know.
Charles Williams and Owen Barfield would be
Barfield. And I'll link to this too. You gave like a 4 or 5 part lecture, very interesting lecture on their world and their reaction to their own world, and how you called them prophets because you thought that they were kind of diagnosing a problem which...
Yeah, I thought they were forward thinking rather than backward looking, actually.
Yeah.
Which is why they're still so popular now.
They had a problem with, they had an issue with meaning, the meaning in the modern world, and they tried to figure out a way to get
Lewis said a very interesting thing in one of his essays. He was always wrestling with the question of how reason, which would include, of course, scientific reason, and imagination are related. He felt they'd been divorced and he felt they needed to be brought together.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things he pointed out was that if you have a kind of rational discourse which accumulates a lot of facts, that's very, very useful, and no one should deny or denigrate it in any way. But you still need to know what to do with the facts. And in the end, you need to know what they mean, or if they mean anything at all. And in this particular essay, Lewis says, the reason is the natural organ of truth, but the imagination is the organ of meaning. But it requires an imaginative leap and a synthesis, a sense of putting yourself into the facts and the facts into yourself, rather than having them as a detached heap. And that requires an imaginative, empathic way. And in fact, of course, Owen Barfield, who thought about these things even more deeply, pointed out that all the great big scientific leaps, the paradigm shifts, the great revolutions, as in the one when we went from the Ptolemaic to the Copernican worldview, from thinking that the Earth was the center and the sun revolved around us, and realizing, no, the sun is the center and we revolve around it. That's not obvious. And for a long time, all the movements of the heavenly bodies could apparently be accounted for in the science of the day by the geocentric model. But then, as observation became better, and particularly with Galileo and others, the observations didn't fit the old model, but nobody had any idea what the new model would be. And it took a great leap of imagination. So just suppose, let me imagine this. And then you kind of do the imagination first, and then you do the math to sort of see if it works. And I think that's almost all the great scientists would.
One doesn't really work without the other, then.
You know, so they're interfolded in us. The imagination doesn't just mean the made up. Obviously, you can imagine a world that's not there, and, you know, that's a fine thing to do. But Coleridge also thought that the imagination was involved in every act of perception. Mm. In fact, he called what he called the primary imagination the living power and prime agent of all perception, you know. And yeah, we need to recognize that it's not saying science versus poetry. Actually, they're both important and valid ways of knowing. And if there is a single thing to be known, if there is a kind of unifying truth, then we're going to need every instrument available to us to get at it. And poetry is one of those instruments just as much as science.
Yeah, we're definitely not going to find it if we find it by dividing these things, basically.
Yeah. Also, in terms of, it's interesting, you know, personal survival, we've all been oppressed by that awful diagram that we used to be given in second-rate courses called, I think it's Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you know, and it's a sort of pyramid, you know, start with food and warmth and, you know, eventually way up the top, you know, art, if you fancy that kind of thing. I mean, that's just not the case. I remember many years ago now when there was a very bad earthquake in Iran. Many thousands of people were killed, but they were running on the TV those stories that you always get sort of 3 or 4 days after an earthquake, when they've got a lot of people out, but they're beginning to give up, you know, people can't have lived that long. They're going to bring the big bulldozers in. They're not going to start tapping or having dogs or listening. And the very last gasp, there's always somebody they get out. And in this particular case, they got this very elderly lady out who'd been buried under the earth for 3 days. And in this tiny niche and cavity that, you know, a table or a pillar had fallen in such a way that she hadn't been crushed. And there was some tiny tricklet of water. But so they brought her out, and elderly Iranian lady. And they said, well, how did you keep going? You know, what gave you the will to live to keep going? And she just said, I recited poetry. And of course, that's a very poetic nation, and the tradition of poetry in Persia and Persian poetry is very strong. And there's a lot of strong. So this woman, you know, was a great keeper of stories and had lain there in the dark reciting stories. And I somehow feel that if she was of the generation in the West that had grown up with sort of celebrity news gossips and daytime TV, I don't think that would have kept her going for 3 days in the dark. Whereas an epic poem in which a hero goes down into the underworld and comes up alive again and saves his people, which is generally what happens in epic poems, you know, that might keep you going.
Yeah, you just think, well, I'm just in the underworld portion of my life.
Yeah, exactly. This is the Epic of Gilgamesh. Go for it. I know how this one ends. Mm-hmm. You know, and or the death and resurrection of Christ, or you know, the Lord of the Rings. I mean, there's a great moment, isn't there, in the Lord of the Rings when you know, Sam and Frodo are in one of the worst places and passes. You know, they're in Mordor. They haven't made it yet. You know, they're running out of everything. They start remembering the tale of Beren and Luthien, and suddenly Sam says, perhaps we'll be in a tale that one day, Mr. Frodo. Perhaps we are in a tale. And then he looks forward to the telling of the tale and how they'll tell the tale of Frodo and the Ring of Doom. And it actually keeps them going.
Yeah.
And then, of course, Tolkien's wonderful eucatastrophe, the good catastrophe. To make their happiness complete at the end, a poet does come forward and strike a lyre and tells the story of nine-fingered Frodo and the Ring of Doom, you know. Mm-hmm. And of course, we, the reader, get a particularly delicious feeling when two characters in a story that's become so real to us actually speculate about whether they might be in a story. And you want to suddenly rush into the story and say, hang on, guys, you are in a story. This is not the last chapter.
Right. Well, let's stay on Tolkien for just a minute, too, because one of the other problems with modern life, you mentioned, was very nicely illustrated by Tolkien's distinction between Saruman and Gandalf.
Yeah.
and
the
maybe
whole way of handling things. And
yeah, the difference between the philosophy and the life of
yeah,
the
the
trees versus the
conversation between Gandalf and Saruman, which was sadly truncated in the film. I mean, there were lots of good things about the film, but there's a really profound philosophical discussion between the two of them, which gets turned into fisticuffs in the film when they're just slamming each other against.
oh yeah. Well, it is Hollywood, you know.
Well, it's fine. I understand you have to do that in film, but when Saruman reveals himself as Saruman the White, you know, and then he has this whole thing, but there's this kind of rainbow sheen, and he says the white page can be written on, you know, the white light can be broken. And Gandalf looks at him sharply and says, he who breaks a thing to find out what it's made of has left the path of wisdom. And that seemed to me an extraordinarily sharp, if you like, insight or analysis into the whole analytic tradition of the West, which consists not only of dissecting people and things, but of breaking the mysteriously woven fabric of the world into its tiniest parts by analysis, and then thinking that if you know all the little parts, you know it all.
Yeah.
Though there were nothing holding them together.
Yeah.
And Coleridge saw that and objected to it. He said, talking about the philosophers Locke and Hume, he said, for them, the world is just an immense heap of little things. And he called them the party of the littlest because they, you know, and he said, no, it's the vast things which the imagination embraces. And the imagination sees the beautiful unity in the disparate parts.
Yeah.
You can't put the unity under a microscope. You can only put the little bits under a microscope.
Well, that somewhat works for time as well as space, doesn't it? I mean, you can take one moment in time and try to say something about it, but it's at least the way human beings seem to work. It's the story, it's the arc of life, the story that matters. It's not one moment, one perhaps terrible moment.
You can have moments. Obviously, there are great mystical moments, but even Eliot in the Four Quartets, who has these wonderful descriptions of these moments, says this about narrative. He says, a people without history is not redeemed from time, for history is a pattern of timeless moments.
Yeah, yeah.
And it's the pattern as much as the timeless moment that's important.
Yeah, patterns, which we just pass through. So it's difficult to see the forest from the trees sometimes.
Yeah.
You have to have these moments where you can see over the tree line and see what's
exactly.
Yeah.
And that's another thing that the imagination does for you and the poetry does for you.
I should talk a little bit about, just because, I mean, one of the many hats, I suppose, that you wear is that you're a priest in the Church of England, right?
Yeah.
And you know, I noticed that some people, I don't know, I live in America, so I can't speak for all of the English speaking world, but in America, there seems to be a divide between, let's say, just Christian believers and kind of more agnostic or atheists. And it seems like, you know, both are a little bit skeptical and even like don't even want to think about the other sometimes.
Yeah.
And it's difficult because I'm an agnostic myself. I mean, I'm a pretty thoroughgoing agnostic. I kind of like the view from there anyway.
Yeah. But that's a perfectly good thing to be, as long as you're agnostic about your agnosticism as well.
I suppose I have to be.
As long as you say, it's like being skeptical about your skepticism, to say, I can quite honestly say there are a series of things I don't know. But the fact that I don't know a thing doesn't mean that it's unknowable. Let alone,
it means I don't know right now. Yeah. Yeah.
So I was an agnostic for a long time, and I think it's a perfectly proper position to take. And if it's the truth as you see it, then you must hold it. But I think the great thing about agnosticism is it's open to new experience and insight.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a sense in which anybody who makes any serious inquiry into truth, which I certainly haven't ceased doing since becoming a Christian. I mean, but anybody who makes a serious inquiry into truth is at that moment necessarily agnostic. As Seamus Heaney says in the brilliant opening line of his poem, The Forge, all I know is a door into the dark. You know, I start with what I know and move into the unknown. That's
good. Yeah, that's very interesting. Yeah, I mean, it limits you if you are kind of if you treat Christianity as a poison, especially as an English speaker, you lose a lot. I've
Oh yeah,
noticed.
I think
You lose a lot of just language. You
of
lose a lot
course.
yeah.
I mean, there are some poisonous forms of so-called Christianity, which aren't really Christianity, but can be very poisonous, and there have been in the past, and there are now, and there always will be. And it's true, as Shakespeare says, that lilies that fester smell far worse than weeds. That doesn't mean that lilies aren't a good thing. And one of my own insights as a Christian that I take from the great Christian philosopher and theologian Saint Augustine is that good is a prime thing and evil is only a derivative thing. In fact, evil is simply a bending or wry or twisting of an initially good thing.
Yeah.
I mean, to use an example that Augustine wouldn't have used because it wasn't invented then. But if I say something is a bad refrigerator, I can only say it's a bad refrigerator because I know that a refrigerator should keep my beer cold, and this refrigerator is warming it, so it's a bad refrigerator.
Yeah.
But I have to have luminous in my mind the Platonic idea of a fridge that actually cooled my beer.
Yes.
In order even to criticize the inadequate fridge that I have.
Yeah.
And that's true of people as well. That if you, as soon as you criticize somebody, you must have a vision of how good they could be. Mm-hmm. And that's also true of religions. And I am the first to admit that the history, the actual practical history of the Christian church over the centuries is deeply ambivalent and horribly shadowed in many respects. Yeah. And yet it is also joyful and full of hope and has done an immense amount of good in the world. And yet it has also cast bad shadows and done evil because it's populated by fallen people. I mean, when I first became a full-on vicar, as it were, having been a curate, which is a sort of vicar in training, I was sent to a parish church which happened to be dedicated to All Saints. So it was All Saints Hertford. And I remember in my first, address to the people of that church saying, I feel I may not belong here, in that if it's All Saints, then I'm not one of them. But I'm wondering if we might also call ourselves all sinners in the process of becoming saints, but all sinners nevertheless, in which case, I'll be right at home. And, we're all flawed in different ways, but for me, as a priest, at the core of the Christian story, one of the things that moved me from agnostic towards it is the idea, it's an unfortunately jargonistic theological word, but it's an important word, which is the idea of redemption. I mean, the analogy is, in the old days, if you were poor, and in fact, probably still now, and you desperately needed money, but you had some precious heirloom in the family, you could take it down to what was called a pawn shop, and PAWN, not PORN, no. And you could put it in there, and they would give you half its value, and they give you a little ticket, and you had 6 months in which you could redeem it, and you could go back and get it back and redeem it. And I love the idea that at the core of the Christian faith is the redemption of all things and of everybody, not the writing off or the pushing away, but the finding us in the kind of crummy pawn shops of our mortgaged lives and getting us back. And that's why I was particularly thrilled in one of those late Leonard Cohen albums. There was that fabulous lyric where he says, I fought against the bottle, but I had to do it drunk. Took my diamond to the pawn shop, but that don't make it junk.
Yeah.
How come you called me here tonight? How come you bother with me with my heart at all? You raise me up in grace, then you set me in a place where I must fall. It's wonderful.
Yeah, Cohen strikes me as in some ways a very respectful heretic, in a sense. I mean, in some ways he was a heretic of his Jewish tradition. He kind of ran away from it for a while, but always came back to it. He was he was a heretic in Buddhism.
That Hineni song, Here I Am. God, that's amazing. I heard Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, our now national rabbi, is a wonderful man and speaker, give an exposition of that Leonard Cohen song in head. Really? So yeah, I found Leonard Cohen, I think the second album I ever bought was the first Leonard Cohen album, the
Songs of Leonard Cohen, yeah,
and that stayed with me. But I'm just glancing on my shelves and vaguely wondering if I have a copy of my book After Prayer, because I've got a poem about Leonard Cohen in it. which I wrote on his death, which picks up on both his long continuity with his Jewish heritage, even though he's not, Orthodox, and yet the availability of his poetry to people of any faith, including mine. Let me just quickly see if I can.
Yeah, please. Yeah, he was definitely the one that struck me the hardest, I think. I remember one line from his first record, from Stories of the Street, where he says, "You're locked into your suffering, and your pleasures are the seal."
Yeah,
that was that's it was a foreshadowing for the rest of his.
Yeah. Do you know? I'm just gonna have to nip out and get this book for a second.
By all means. We'll either cut or I will do something interesting meanwhile.
Yeah, so I think Leonard Cohen's one of the great. When he died, I wrote this. I've been listening to that last album a lot anyway, so it was extraordinary,
Yeah.
And I wrote this as a rondeau, the poetic form rondeau, which I thought was appropriate for him. And it's just called a rondeau for Leonard Cohen. I had the great honor that this poem was read. There was a memorial event for him in Montreal, and somebody had found this poem, on the web and wrote to me and said, could it be read? And I was thrilled.
Right.
A rondeau for Leonard Cohen. Like David's psalm, you named our pain and left us, but the songs remain to search our wounds and bring us balm, till every song becomes a psalm, and your restraint is our refrain. Between the stained glass and the stain, the dark heart and the open vein, between the heart storm and the harm, like David's psalm. I see you by the window pane, alive within your own domain. The light is strong, the seas are calm. You chant again the telling charm that names and naming heals our pain, like David's psalm.
That's beautiful. Yeah, that's wonderful. That's a little callback to Love Calls You by Your Name too.
Well, exactly. Thank you. I'm glad you got that. Yeah. Between the stain, between there's something in your open vein. Yeah. Once again, love calls you by your name.
That's fantastic.
So that you don't need to have a definition of poetry or need to, you read or hear something like that, and that's poetry, and you're never going to forget it.
And just as an aside, it's a mysterious and unfortunate thing for me, but I can always remember these lines when they're in song form. Unlike you, who can apparently remember everything you've ever read in poetry, I can't remember anything on the page.
I've got a memory for poetry. I realize now that it's an auditory memory. It's not actually to do with seeing it written down.
Really? You can just,
And but unfortunately, I don't have a memory for names. It's terrible. I've been both a teacher and a pastor.
Yeah.
For most of my adult life. And the core of that is precisely to call people by their name.
That can be tough, yeah.
And I'm going, oh my goodness, and I'm always trying to set up some conversation in which they'll mention their own name somehow, But I can remember poetry, and I know more poetry than I know, if you see what I mean. I don't know that I know a poem.
Yeah.
Until I'm in a conversation where the poem would be appropriate, and I summon the first line, and lo and behold, it's like, it works like, do you remember those when you had magnets as a kid and you would like pick up a paper clip with a magnet, and then amazingly the paper clip would pick up the next paper clip.
Yes.
On a chain, the magnetism went all the way through. Right. And poetry works like that for me, that I remember a line and then I remember all the other lines,
That's good. That's great. I'd like to figure out how to do that. That's so all of this, I'm wondering, it's kind of pointing to a question that I have in terms of just living in a strange time.
Yeah.
And it seems like everybody has this collective feeling, a feeling of crisis that's kind of developing. Some talk in terms of the meaning crisis. I keep hearing that phrase. Some people talk of it in terms of decline of the West and things like that. And there's just a kind of a malaise and just a like disappointment with at least English speaking culture right now. And I'm wondering if you have an idea as to why that. Everybody has some theory. If you have an idea as to why that could be, and if there's any way the things that we've been talking about could at least be a place of refuge for people, and if not an antidote.
There's an essay by Owen Barfield where he says, of all the men, he's writing in the mid-20th century, of all the menacing signs in this century, says the worst is the crisis of meaning. It seems that the more we come to know about the world, the less we can find any meaning in it.
Mm-hmm.
Eliot, writing at about the same time, in the Choruses from the Rock, which is one of his less well-known works, he has this, as it were, stranger ask the question that we need to have asked. And the question, it takes two questions, related questions. He wrote this in the 1940s, so it was before the computer and the information age. So it's astonishingly prophetic. These are the two questions.
Mm. Yeah.
Where is the knowledge we have lost in information? Where is the wisdom we have lost in knowledge? So do you see how that immediately introduces a hierarchy between information, knowledge, and wisdom?
Yeah.
You can have as much information as you like, but unless you have the knowledge that tells you how to order the information and what its significance it is, the data is meaningless.
Yeah.
Then you can accumulate knowledge. But the more knowledge you accumulate, the more you need to know whether that's good knowledge or bad, what to do with the knowledge, whether it's right to act on the knowledge or not, what the knowledge tells, whether the knowledge is only of things out there that you can manipulate and never of what it is in here who's doing the manipulating and why.
Mm, yep.
So you need wisdom. So he's basically saying the more information you've got, the more you need knowledge. The more knowledge you've got, the more you need wisdom. But actually, we've lost the knowledge in the information and lost the wisdom in the knowledge.
Yeah, yeah.
So I think that's part of the nature of the crisis. And what Owen Barfield in the essay is called The Coming Trauma of Materialism. And basically he says the way we're living and the way we're seeing the world is unsustainable because it's unreal. And the bit of reality that's missing from the reductive scientific account of the world and of ourselves as just machines to be reprogrammed, all that stuff.
Yeah.
The bit that is the missing knowledge is only accessible by the imagination. Yeah. And because we've downgraded the imagination, we actually haven't got the right instruments to find out who we are and where we're going. And we need to re-engage the imagination is basically what Barfield says. And I think out of the crisis I mean, obviously we're in this temporary pandemic crisis, but in a way that's simply amplified a bigger crisis.
It's sped everything up. Yeah.
Basically, we're going to need to re-engage the imagination. And in fact, that is happening.
Yeah.
I mean, it's happening sometimes in very irrational forms. And, you know, people who wouldn't believe anything will now believe everything, you know. And people who go from extreme skepticism to absolutely credulous ability. I mean, it always strikes me that in the most skeptical age of all, we have gullible people by the millions following the most inane conspiracy theories that you could possibly dream up.
All of a sudden, yeah, right, yeah.
And they shift from the skepticism to the credulity without even knowing that they've done it. Because the skepticism and the credulity are two sides of the same coin. They're both actually a desire to have a private certainty that solves all your problems. You know, and you can't have that. You have to have a collective feeling towards truth that you do as a whole people together, including the past, including the dead poets. You know, there's a great passage also in Chesterton's Orthodoxy where he talks about why he believes in democracy, and it's a great encomium of democracy. And he says the great thing about democracy is that it goes about actively asking the least and most marginalized people, the shyest, for their opinion.
Yes.
It's actually going out to somebody who never gets listened to and say, we're going to listen to you.
Yep.
Give us your opinion on this ballot paper.
And you're always holding out the possibility. It's like what you said to me about being agnostic about my agnosticism.
Yeah.
You're always holding out this possibility that even your strongly held beliefs might be wrong. So you better let somebody else say.
So you go out and on a mass scale and you ask these marginalized people their opinion. But then here's the sting in the tail. So Chesterton says, if I believe in democracy, then I also believe in tradition. Because if I were to ask myself in an age which calls itself progressive and is besotted with the next invention and the most modern thing and has lost its sense of history, who are the most marginalized people in humanity? The answer is the dead. It's the people who lived before us. It's the long wisdom of the old ages.
Yes.
And he says, basically, we need to ask them too. And then he sums it all up in a classic pithy Chestertonian epigram. And he says, tradition is the democracy of the dead.
Right. Yeah. You can't forget it. You can't forget
As it happens, I'm a Grateful Dead fan, so the dead always means something else to me as well.
Now that's truly balancing. Chesterton and the Grateful Dead. I like that. Yeah. There's also another part of what you're talking about that has to do with the way the individual copes just in their day-to-day life and deals with reality. And it reminds me, I just recorded a podcast about literature where I read certain poems and stuff. And one of them was from the priest R.S. Thomas.
Oh, he's great.
The Bright Field.
Oh, that is one of the great poems. Yeah.
And he's in The Bright Field. I have it somewhere here. He talks about, he's constantly talking about, apparently I'm new to his poetry, but he's constantly talking about turning aside. And he says here,
life is not hurrying on towards a receding future or hankering after you better read it.
Yes, that's pretty much word for word.
Okay, you read it though, just in case.
No, that's actually right. Life is not hurrying on to a receding future nor hankering after an imagined past. It is the turning aside, like Moses, to the miracle of the lit bush, to a brightness that seemed as transitory as your youth once, but it is the eternity that awaits you.
Is the eternity that awaits you. That's a great line, because the poem starts off in lament, saying, I drove past this field, I didn't stop, I missed. But it turns around and says, no, it is the eternity that awaits you.
Yes.
You haven't missed it. That's the great thing in that poem.
Yeah, that's right.
There's a fabulous poem by Seamus Heaney called Postscript, which is, I think, literally a postscript to the R.S. Thomas poem.
Interesting.
It appears at the end of one of his volumes, so it's called Postscript.
A postscript to The Bright Field, you think?
Yeah, which is about stopping and thinking, if I park up my car and go, and look. And it's a fabulous poem. I commend it to you.
Definitely, I'll definitely look that up. The idea of turning aside, to me too, has a lot to do with turning aside from, it seems like, from our distractions, which nowadays are numerous. There's another T.S. Eliot line, might be The Chorus of Rock as well, which is, again, sums up our age. He says, distracted from distraction by distraction. Right, yeah. How do we reclaim our poetic inner lives at the same time that we don't get too cynical? Because it says in the poem here, it says, life is not hurrying onto a receding future, nor hankering after an imagined past. So it's not like nostalgia, right? You don't want to be nostalgic and idealize the past.
Oh yeah. And that's
how do we keep these good things about technology as well?
Oh, totally. I think, I have a poem called the Singing Bowl, which begins with the line, begin the song exactly where you are. Mm-hmm. Remain within the world of which you are made. Call nothing common in the earth or air. Accept it all and let it be for good. Start with the very breath you breathe in now. And it's about being absolutely where you are. And I'm like many poets and scholars, tempted to nostalgia for the past. I'm always going like, why wasn't I
likewise
in the era of the Romantic poets? They had great poetry, great clothes, what's not to like? Yeah. Why have I ended up in the 21st century? But there's another part of me that goes, William Blake, one of the poets I really admire, and who is like another great prophet, You know, he did his best to get his poetry out there, and he created little copper plates and he printed them, and he colored them all in and he put them out. And like, if you think about a masterpiece of William Blake's, like the Songs of Innocence and Experience,
yeah,
in Blake's own day, not only was the poems not really understood in the way that they're understood now, and we see them as profoundly important now, but they were physically in existence by the end of Blake's life, only 200 copies of those poems, which he had personally printed and colored. And it wasn't until late in the 19th century, when he was rediscovered by Yeats, that anybody knew about it. So I might say I wish I'd lived in that age, but here am I in the age of the internet and in the age of blogging. And for quite a long, I mean, I have a publisher now, and I have a paper publisher, and I'm very glad of that. But at a point at which I was writing things and thinking them and composing poems and songs that I felt might speak into our age, I was suddenly given by technology the means to communicate those. And a community of people who were interested in them and enjoyed them and wrote back to me, which sustained me. You know, before, I'm old fashioned, so I was very glad to get a conventional publisher, and I'm glad to have my books as books. So, you know, I would be the last person to denigrate the benefits of our technology, but I would also be the first person to say all these goods cast shadows. And one of the big questions to be asked about technology is who has it and who doesn't have it, who is excluded by it, who controls it, who decides in the end. Now, I think there's still a certain element of radical freedom in the internet. Though I think it's under threat. And of course, it's a radical freedom which is grossly abused, as all freedom will be. But theologically, speaking as a priest for a moment, one of the things I take from my theology is that God thought freedom was worth it. That the archetypal story, which is a kind of mythopoeic story of the fall and the Garden of Eden, is about how God creates us free, even though he knows we'll abuse our freedom and he's going to have to come in and rescue us. Why? Because later in the Bible, we learn that God is love. And basically, you can't have love without freedom. There's no forced love, you know. God knows, we know with Me Too and all of that, we know everybody needs to understand that, you know, the very basis of all loving, whether it's physical or spiritual or emotional, is free consent. And that's why there's always a shadow cast on love if one of the two persons is in power and the other isn't. And that's why we've needed the radical liberations of many kinds that we've had. But that's all there to me in the Bible, that God makes people completely free.
I agree with that. It's all in there. It really is.
So, you know, talking about technology and the internet, I have the same fear, dystopian fears that everybody has, that we're really going to screw ourselves and the world up even more than we already have with our technology obsessions. And I listen carefully to I belong to the Green Party here, and I listen carefully to my eco-warrior friends and take note. But I do not despair. I do not say that we must be coerced out of our technology. I do not say that the free, inventive, creative human spirit must now be shut up forever in case we do more damage. Because the free, inventive, creative human spirit will also find ways of redemption. And because I believe in redemption, I don't believe in the extirpation and you know, utter eradication of things we disagree with. I believe in all things being found and reformed and brought back to their original flourishing.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, and it seems also that we are in an era where whenever we have an opportunity to look back on it, it will be just profoundly strange how quickly it came upon us. And how, you know, it's not like we all got together and said, okay, there's going to be this explosion of technology and social media, and we have to be careful about this, and you have to watch out for that. It's just like here, you know, 12, 13, 14-year-olds, you're going to start with this, and then your parents are going to get into it, and then there's going to be, you know, we're all kind of just walking blind into this, relatively recent phenomena. And maybe it's just a matter of finding our balance, I guess.
Yeah, and I think we have the resources to do that. But one of those resources is poetry.
Okay, yeah, right. Yeah. That's a very interesting way of putting it.
Another one is single malts.
I know, I keep refilling. What are you drinking for single malt, by the way?
I'm drinking Lafroig, which is an Islay malt. It's a very smoky, peaty, you know, it's you can kind of almost taste the sea and the dark peat smoke in it. It's
I had it in my hand yesterday and I was weighing the options. I ended up going with this because this is a new relatively inexpensive Glenfiddich that they
Glenfiddich. That's a Speyside malt, and it's a kind of lighter one.
Yeah, but, they finished it in bourbon. Well, they finished it in American.
I sometimes think, you know, people think, oh wow, you're really hardcore. You drink these very smoky Islay malts, but I think on the contrary, I'm not delicate and subtle enough to, you know, I haven't got a sufficiently educated palate to
That's how I feel. Yeah, bring on the flavor. Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, in my country now, there's been a tariff on these things. So every bottle of scotch is now $20-$30 more than it used to be. So
I know, it's terrible. I mean,
Lagavulin is totally out for me now.
So I tell you a funny thing though, because I noticed in America, but see, the whiskey's more expensive, but the tobacco is unbelievably more cheap. So we have a massive tariff on tobacco here. So my bowl of black cherry tobacco is to me what the Lagavulin is to you. It's a kind of luxury.
Just beyond reach. Yes. That's funny. Well, before we wrap up, I wanted to, well, first of all, I want to just read a little something and then talk about your pilgrimage that you had just been on, because that's another aspect of, in a way, turning to one side and
being, it is indeed, yeah,
reacquainting ourselves with nature. There's a little book I have here full of errors by Werner Herzog, the German filmmaker.
Oh, and right, yeah.
In the 70s, he walked from Munich to Paris in a snowstorm, and I was just poking through it the other day, and he wrote a book kind of en route, and it kind of reminded me, you have a much more, luckily, I think, pleasant journey, I hope, than this one. But
yeah, I did a walking pilgrimage along the old the sort of the Augustin Camino, which is the reliving the moments in the late 6th century when Augustine came to England and began to bring the faith here. Yeah,
beautiful. Yeah, he walked from Munich to Paris, and he said, I'll just
a long walk.
Do a little, yeah, it's a long walk. In 3 weeks, I think it took him. And he said, for the first time, sunshine again. And I thought to myself, this will do you good. But now my shadow was lurking beside me. And because I was heading west, it was often in front of me as well. At noon, my shadow cowered there creepingly down around my legs, causing me, in truth, such anxiety. The snow had smothered a car. It was flat as a book, this car. Much of the snow melted during the night, leaving large patches lying about. And further up on the hill, a shroud of snow had formed. Vast open country, rolling hills with scattered woods in between. The fields somewhat brownish again. Hares, pheasants. One pheasant behaved like a madman. It danced, spun about, uttered strange sounds. Yet it wasn't mating. It ignored me as if it were blind. I could have grabbed it with my hand just like that, but chose not to. Little brooks flowed down the sloping meadows over my trail. A spring spews up in the middle of a path, and further below the brook is broad as a lake. Crows are battling for something. One of them falls into the water. In the wet meadow lies a forgotten plastic football. The tree trunks steam like living beings. On the bench past Seedorf, I take a rest because of my problematic groin. I could feel it during the night, but didn't know how to position my leg. Spending the night cost 12 marks, including breakfast. Felled trees assume a silver sheen in the light. They're steaming. Greenfinches, buzzards. The buzzards have accompanied me all the way from Munich. And reading it, I was just thinking, it's amazing when you read an account of somebody going on a long walk. And as he said, he always says to young filmmakers, his advice is to read and to travel on foot, because you get certain rhythms and you notice things like the mice in the fields that you wouldn't ever notice in a car or even on a bike, probably. And it just interested me. And when you went on your pilgrimage, I was wondering what you thought about that, if you'd kind of gotten into a different rhythm and noticed different things about the natural world.
Absolutely. You have a different perspective. It slows you down, obviously. Yeah. You see things you meet people and speak to them in a way that you never would in a car. So you have this series of other encounters. And if you have a sense of history, then you know the road you're on, and you know what the buildings mean for it. And of course, I'm very fortunate, obviously, in the British Isles, we've got this layers and layers of history. So my walk from Rochester to Canterbury and then on to Ramsgate on the coast, sort of along the chalk downs of Kent, which is the Garden of England, you know, was layered in all kinds of ways. Rochester is a very Dickensian town, in literally Dickens lived there, and you know, you can see it through Dickens' eyes, and yet the cathedral, you know, is a 7th century foundation, and you know, so it's got this huge, long ecclesial history, and then it's got all the recent industrial revolution history, and it's got, you know, it's extraordinarily sort of multi-layered place, and you get a different perspective. And then walking through, the thing that surprised me walking through Kent, and maybe it's a sign of global warming or something, Kent is famous in English culture for hops, for the hop fields, and poor families from the East End, the only holiday they could get was to go down picking hops in Kent, but at least they had the fresh air of the countryside. And students did it. And I'm probably the last generation of students that eked out their meager living by going down and spending 2 weeks hard labor gathering hops in Kent.
Really?
And of course, as a student, you felt you were contributing to something noble, because you know these hops would end up in beer. Right. You know, that so I was expecting the hop fields, and I saw them. But what I wasn't expecting was the vineyards, because English wine has begun to become a bit of a thing, and it's grown mostly down in Kent, which is in the south, and it's sunnier. And
I so we mentioned that, or either write about it or mention it, and it surprised me. I in my American mind, I thought, "What are you talking about? They don't make wine in England."
No, there is English wine, and it's actually quite good. I had a very fine bottle of Kentish wine when we got to Canterbury to celebrate, and so. But of course, walking through the vineyards, you're conscious of the vineyards. There were vineyards in Kent in the days of the Roman occupation, you know, when the Romans were here, you know, and there's something about the road that makes you feel all these different layers of history. I mean, there's a great opening line of Chesterton's poem about the rolling English road, where he says, "Before the Romans came to Rye, or out to Severn strode, the rolling English drunkard made the rolling English road," you know. and so there's something, you know, very, very satisfying about the slowness of the pace and the observations. And as Herzog has said that, you know, you see the wildlife, and you see the birds, and we saw deer, and we walked through patches of ancient woodland that have been woodland since before the Norman conquest, you know. And I mean, the Great Forest in Hampshire is called the New Forest. It's still called the New Forest because it was planted by William the Conqueror in 1066. You know, we still
yeah, that's very new.
You know.
Yeah, I'm from New England, and we pride ourselves on being 300, you know, years old.
Yeah,
we're really old.
So there's that. For me, probably it's as much literary associations as any others that happened to me on the road.
Yeah.
But of course, I was with two companions, two of my oldest friends. We were all at university together, and with one of them, I was at school together. So we'd known him for 40 years, and we're three very different men with different vocations, you know. And yet we were all just coming to a kind of change in life and early retirement, and we thought, let's get together and walk and talk. And of course, in some ways, we were very silly and reverted to our boyhood and told all the sort of stupid school jokes that we were, you know, caroused in pubs.
Of course.
But on another level, so we revisited our youth, but we also shared things with each other walking along the road that we might not have shared in any other circumstance, partly because we're walking side by side and not sitting face to face. You can kind of throw off a remark and hear a remark back. You're on a common journey.
I see, yeah. There's no real pressure to keep the conversation flowing naturally.
We took it at different paces.
Yeah.
So sometimes there'd be two of us ahead and one of us behind, and a different kind of conversation would take place. And then it would be different when we were sitting at our ease in the evening. So, you know, obviously one of the things that we were conscious of as we walked, particularly the journey into Canterbury, we all you know, fortunately, we'd all had a fairly good education and we'd been at Cambridge together. And so we all knew our Chaucer. And therefore we were full of the Chaucerian tales, and particular bits of woodlands that I mentioned. And we were recalling and quoting the Chaucer, and then thinking, and of course Chaucer, all of life is there, you know. I mean, Chaucer's Canterbury Tales has every possible kind of character. And in fact, my friend Sean and I, my other friend George joined us later, we deliberately, although we didn't start walking till we got to Canterbury, we began in London at the George in Southwark, which is the oldest galleried tavern still, is referred to sometimes as Shakespeare's local. The Tabard, which the pilgrims in Chaucer start from, was next door, but that's since become a railway yard and was sadly not preserved. But the George is as close to it as you can get.
Yeah.
So we had this sense of beginning a pilgrimage in a place where years of pilgrimage began. I mean, we weren't doing it in April as Chaucer's were, but we were, you know, Lungan folk to gan on pilgrimages. We felt ourselves part of a very long tradition. And obviously our pilgrimage was very different from theirs. Two of us had a religious purpose in it, and one of us who's an agnostic, or probably more likely an atheist, didn't. One of us was Catholic, one of us was Anglican, and one of us was atheist.
Yeah.
And we had full understanding of and respect for, but also a kind of pugilistic willingness to fence with the others about all of those things.
Like any good friendship should.
And interestingly, the two of us who had faith, we were, you know, I was a priest and my friend was a teacher and headmaster, and the one of us who didn't is a really distinguished medieval historian who, as it happened, was about to publish a book which centered on what was going on in the ruins of the Priory of Augustine when we got there. So we had like the most expert guide to the way our faith had been lived once in that place, from a person who didn't share it, but in many ways understood as much of it as we did.
Yeah. That's very interesting. That really is kind of like climbing two different sides of the same mountain in a sense.
Yeah.
That's wonderful. I thank you for that description. I wondered about that, and I guess, I mean, I've kept you now for an hour and 20 minutes. It's been a great pleasure. I suppose I should wind things down a little bit. I guess now, now that you've come back, I'd like to just wonder. I'd like to ask you if you have a different perspective, if you have new projects on the horizon as a result of that, or if you're just back to work, or what.
Well, I think I don't know. I officially start, actually, literally today, my retirement from my job as chaplain, which I took early in order to be basically a full-time poet. So that's sort of what's on the horizon. At the moment, I'm just revising a book I wrote, what will become a book, but essentially a long sequence of poems I wrote during lockdown in response to the Book of Psalms. It's going to be called David's Crown, and I've written. So,
you've been sharing these online, right? You've been sharing.
But that's sort of independent of the pilgrimage. I've written briefly. I have to write. I write a weekly column for the back page of the Church Times. So I've written 3 little pieces about the pilgrimage, which in a sense, therefore, draw on it for that. Which the third of which is going to be published tomorrow. But I can't say yet. I'm sure this pilgrimage will lead to something new. I felt it was very rich and fruitful. I could tell you individual things I can remember, but the total meaning of it is I'm too close to it to know what it looks like. It's like being at the base of a mountain when you only see the first hills. You need to get away from it to see what it is. So I imagine, you know, I remember when I went on my first retreat, silent retreat in a Benedictine abbey, and 2 or 3 friends of mine from college had all been on this retreat together, and we'd been completely silent, which, as you can imagine, was quite a task for me. Some people say I've been making up for lost time ever since. But I remember the priest who'd taken us on the retreat said, "So was it a good retreat?" And a friend of mine who's much wiser than I am looked him straight in the eye and said, "I'll tell you in 5 years' time."
Right. Yeah. It takes a bit of work on the back end, I guess.
So I wouldn't know quite what this pilgrimage is about until it's long over.
Fair enough. That's true. Before we do go, would you be willing to read us a poem of yours?
Yeah.
I don't know, anything that really strikes you at the moment.
Yeah, well, since we've been talking about walking,
Yeah.
I'll maybe read you a poem I wrote quite some time ago. It's in my book, The Singing Bowl. It's called Prayer Walk. It's like prayer/walk.
Okay.
And it's kind of modeled on George Herbert's poem Prayer, where Herbert just lists phrases. You know, he says prayer, the church's banquet, angel's age, God's breath in man returning to his birth, soul in paraphrase, heart in pilgrimage. That's a great definition.
Yeah.
Anyway, so I decided, picking up on heart in pilgrimage, that I'd write a poem which is just a list of phrases, but the phrases would all be about my pleasure in walking. But I would choose the phrases in such a way that each of them, if you reflected on it, was also about prayer.
Okay.
So I'll finish with this one because you'll recognize, if you're a walker, you'll recognize all of these things. So prayer walk. A hidden path that starts at a dead end. Old ways renewed by walking with a friend, and crossing places taken hand in hand. The passages where nothing need be said, with bruised and scented sweetness underfoot, an unexpected birdsong overhead. The sleeping life beneath a dark-mouthed burrow, the rooted secrets rustling in a hedgerow, the land's long memory in ridge and furrow. A track once beaten and now overgrown with complex textures, every kind of green, land and cloudscape melting into one. The rich meandering of streams at play, a setting out to find oneself astray, and coming home at last a different way.
Very, very, very beautiful. Thank you very much, Malcolm Guite. It's been a pleasure. And you want to do this again.
All the best to The CommonToad. It's a great name, by the way. I think The CommonToad is like.
Thank you. I stole it from George Orwell. He had wrote an essay, Thoughts on the Common Toad once. And I thought, yeah.
That's very good. Well, if you're going to steal from the best.
That's what I try to do. Thank you very much, sir.